welcome back to another episode of the Envisiontech podcast. I'm your host, Paul Gagan, and this week we're going to be talking about how digital accessibility affects mental health. We have talked quite a lot on this podcast about digital accessibility, and I feel like by now, if you've listened to even just a few of the episodes, you probably have a good understanding of accessibility. Obviously, this is really important, and I have touched on a little bit as to why this is important and what it can be like when something isn't accessible. But something that I feel like a lot of people don't really consider is not only the fact that maybe I can't access an app or a website or whatever, and that's bad, but what actual effect does that have on somebody with a disability? Because I can tell you that it definitely does affect me sometimes, and I feel like more than maybe people realize. Obviously, it's great that we have a lot of things that can help make websites and other things like that more accessible. For example, there's screen readers, right, which I've talked about before. And they are of a huge help because without those, I couldn't access anything in a digital format. But obviously, those aren't perfect usually. And even if they are, support for them varies wildly. As I've mentioned before, some websites are really great with screen readers and they're perfectly fine to use, and others are an absolute nightmare. And the same is for, any kind of accessibility tools, or just anybody who needs any kind of consideration when it comes to accessibility, whether it's to do with captions or color contrast or whatever, really. Honestly, there is always a problem, I want to say. Whether it's the movie you're watching doesn't have captions, or it doesn't have audio description, or the website you're visiting has bad color contrast, it doesn't work with your screen reader, the magnifier that you're using doesn't work with it properly. Whatever it might be, there are so many examples. So it is great that we have all of these tools that can kind of help fix some of these problems, if you will, but they don't fix all of them. And I feel like that is even more frustrating when you use, for example, a website with a screen reader and it works fine, and then you go to another website and it doesn't, because you're like, this should work. Like, this clearly is doable. This is clearly possible. Screen readers have existed for quite a while, and there are loads of websites that work properly with them, so why doesn't this one? Why doesn't this movie have captions? Why doesn't it, have like a audio description track or whatever? It can actually be almost more frustrating when you have that kind of experience with using things that are accessible, but then not all of the other things you might be using meet those same standards. And it's not about them being perfect or anything, just some of them aren't usable. So it can be actually, annoying in itself, even just the variation that you can experience. Obviously, I'm a software engineer, so I use technology every day. It is literally my job, to sit down and use a computer for the whole day, pretty much. So it can have a really big effect on me and others like me who rely on technology, not just in our personal lives, but in our professional lives too. And I can tell you from my experience, it can be frustrating, annoying, upsetting, demotivating. It can make you feel like you're the problem. Sometimes like you're worthless or whatever. Because you can't use a simple website. You can't just go and use that app. You can't just watch that movie. You can't, whatever it might be, And I'm not sure if, people who haven't had those kind of experiences can understand how that feels. But if you can, I feel like you can understand why it's such a big problem. Like when I talk about why we need things to be accessible, it is because, it's better for everybody and it can help you grow your market share and, whatever. But it's also just because when you don't do that, it has real effects on real people, It's not just, you go to the website and, you got an error and whatever. I can't use so many different tools, so many different websites. I can't, do whatever it is. I can't play a certain game. I can't watch a certain movie. I can't read a certain book. Even that, oh wow, this was so annoying. So I'm reading a very long series of books right now. And there are, I think, around 30 books in this series, right? It's a big series. And I got to book 8, and that was great. I was really enjoying the series, and I was looking for the audiobook for book 9, and it just didn't seem to exist anywhere. I couldn't find it. Literally nowhere. And even the places where it did seem to be available, it wasn't available here in Ireland. And that's technically not accessibility, even though, honestly, audiobooks are one of the only real ways that I can read books. I could get Braille books or whatever, but number one, physical Braille books are huge, impractical, and there's only a few places that you can actually get those. And Braille displays are incredibly expensive, and I don't have one. So yeah, like even simple things like being able to read a book, it is so frustrating when I can't just go and get the book that I want, like everyone else in the world. And these books exist. Like it was available on Kindle, it was available on loads of other places. You could buy the book, you could get it literally just about everywhere. But the audiobook, no, I couldn't, and I was, willing to pay a bit more for it or whatever if I had to, as opposed to getting it on Audible. But I wasn't able to find it. I did eventually. I think like it's been a month, and I found it like 2 days ago. And I'm not sure whether it's going to be more expensive or not. I'm just because the prices are different. Audible is in pounds, and then this new thing is in dollars, so I'm not entirely sure how that works out. But yeah, like I shouldn't have to spend, weeks or a month looking for a book. Like, that's ridiculous. It shouldn't take more than 30 seconds. It is so frustrating when you can't do basic things like that. And that's just, a book that I just want to read. That's not even anything that actually impacts my life. Like, whether it be in work when I'm trying to like code something, or, if I'm trying to use like my banking app. Oh, even that. So I use Revolut for my personal and business bank, right? And it is better than a lot of other banks, actually, in terms of accessibility, but it has actually been getting worse. So if you haven't used Revolut before, when you go onto the app, there's a See More button to view your transactions. I can't click that button anymore. I used to be able to until about 2 weeks ago, and now I can't. I can't view my card details. I can't actually log into the business app on my phone anymore because for whatever reason the little keypad that shows up is no longer accessible. It was until around a month ago, and now it's just not. I literally can't do it, not at all. So, like, it's just things like that. It might seem like, oh, it's not a big deal if my website's not accessible, and if it was one website in the world, yeah. But when it's almost everything that I want to do or everything that I want to use that isn't accessible, it actually does take a toll on your mental health, and that's just me. I'm pretty used to it. And honestly, a lot of the time I'm good at finding alternatives or whatever, but there's a lot of people out there that maybe aren't as good at finding alternatives, or who maybe are recently disabled, who it's tough enough adapting to that as it is, but then having to try and find all these new ways of doing things is made even more difficult when the things that you should be able to use don't work anymore. So it really does have a huge impact on people, not only what they can do, but just how they feel. And I'm not saying that in a, oh yeah, they feel a bit sad, like day-to-day life effect, literally it affects your everyday life. As I mentioned, these can have a big effect on your everyday life. And that can have a huge emotional toll, as I've already mentioned. It can leave you feeling obviously frustrated, even isolated. Like, let's say everybody that you talk to is using a certain messaging app, and that app isn't accessible. Well, now you can't talk to your friends anymore. Or let's say there's a new update for WhatsApp tomorrow, right? Which is really popular. A lot of people use it. I use it, and it becomes inaccessible. What am I supposed to do? That actually kind of happened recently. When you long press on a message on WhatsApp, usually there's a copy button, a forward button, a more options button, whatever, and then there's reactions. And for a good few weeks there, the sort of actions that you can take didn't work anymore. They just seemed to be gone for me. And they weren't actually gone. They were still there. They just weren't accessible anymore. So literally day to day, these things can change and they can be taken away. As strange as that may sound, it does happen. Even with big apps from big companies, they get less accessible. And sometimes they fix it, but sometimes they don't. So again, you could be left feeling really isolated and like feeling really inadequate. I said when you can't do basic things like, find a book to read, or talk to your friends, or, manage your own banking, or send an email, or literally anything, and I can't stress that enough, how much of a toll that can take on a person. And I said, honestly, for me, it's not nearly as bad as it probably is for other people. I can't imagine, being both deaf and blind, you know? Because at least, when I watch a movie, I have audio description, and obviously, if you're deaf, you might have captions. And, I feel like there are some accommodations in place, although they're not perfect, for quite a few disabilities. But just imagine, that even those accommodations you couldn't use. And that does happen sometimes too. Sometimes things are supposed to be accessible and they're not. But again, it really does have a huge effect on literally anybody. And the thing is, you have to remember that could be you. Right now, it might not be, but it could be. Tomorrow, in 20 years, whenever. That could be you. And then you'll be the one frustrated about there not being, audio description or whatever it might be. This might also sound strange, but even using these tools can be honestly quite draining. So, even using a screen reader, a lot of the time it can be really inefficient. Instead of just looking at a screen and clicking a button, I have to navigate through all these links. I have to listen to what each one says because I need to find the one that I want. I can't just look on the screen. I have to check everything on the screen. And sometimes it takes ages because there could be, maybe 3 links in the nav bar at the top of the page, or there could be 100 because you can scroll horizontally, and maybe there's no headings, so I can't skip past it or whatever. It can be actually exhausting even just using these tools that help make things accessible sometimes. And I know that might sound really strange, but it's true. So yeah, again, it's great that we have these things that we can use to help make things more accessible, but strangely enough, they can also contribute to these problems sometimes. Not necessarily the screen readers themselves, it's more so the websites or apps that you're using, but obviously, because they're not optimized or whatever it might be, it actually ends up making your experience even worse in a weird way. As I mentioned, this can affect both your professional and personal life. So, a lot of people, when they finish their work, they get to say, okay, I'm done for the day. Any problems I was facing in work, I'm no longer facing. Whereas when you're dealing with things that aren't accessible, that isn't necessarily true. And yes, you might not be using the exact same things, but you're probably still going to be facing a lot of the same problems. Whether I'm in work and I'm trying to use something that's inaccessible, and then I finish work, and then in my personal life I'm trying to use something that's inaccessible. It doesn't say, my brain doesn't go, okay, well, actually these are 2 different things, one was in work and one isn't. It's like, oh, just another inaccessible thing. Here we go again. And this can be really frustrating, especially in work, because you need to get something done. And now you can't. It's not just something maybe that you wanted to do. If it's something that you're supposed to be doing in work, you need to do it. So it can be a really big issue. Especially in the technology industry, there's a lot of, expectations that things will be accessible, and there's a lot of high standards around that, but then people just don't meet them. You're like, oh wow, this person's a great software engineer, they have made some really cool projects in the past, surely they will know what accessibility is, and they will know about adding alt text to their images, they'll know about putting headings on the page, and they just don't. They just don't. I don't know whether they actually just don't know about it at all, or if they're just not bothered with it, or whatever it is. But so often, there's been so many times where I've been advertised a tool or something like that, and I'm like, wow, that would make my life so much easier. I go and have a look at it. Oh, not accessible. I guess I'm not using it. Oh, well, whatever, And that can be really frustrating because, as I said, it's literally my job to be a software engineer and to run my company. And then even when you can't do that properly, I said it can lead to people feeling inadequate, like you're not good enough, etc. Because that's kind of what it makes it seem like. It makes it seem like you're the problem, which obviously that isn't actually the case. The people not being bothered to make things accessible when it's honestly not that much effort are the problem. You can't honestly call yourself a good software engineer or even a good business if you can't even be bothered to make sure that people can't use your service or your product. It's bad. That's a bad product. It's a bad service. Whatever. If it came out tomorrow that 20% of people couldn't use Netflix anymore, people would be outraged. They'd be like, oh my God, what is this? These people are paying for this service. How is, Netflix, such a big company, going to stop, tens of millions of people from using their service? But when it's people with, disabilities and they can't use, thousands, tens of thousands of products and services, however many it may be, nothing. You might hear about it every once in a while. Maybe there'll be like a new law or whatever, a new regulation. Honestly, the fact that we have to have laws and regulations about some of this stuff is a little bit ridiculous. I'm glad that it's happening because clearly it's needed, but I don't know why it's needed. I don't know why this wasn't something that maybe people could think, hey, how about we make sure that everybody can use the thing that we're making? I said it can be a really big problem, like for your confidence. I said especially in a professional setting, because that's supposed to be what you're good at. For example, me, I'm supposed to be a software engineer, and I'm supposed to be good. I'm not supposed to be terrible at my job. I own my own business. I said like I'm supposed to be at least pretty okay at what I do. But then turns out sometimes I can't even do basic things, even making Android apps. I can't use Android Studio. And yes, I did find other ways to make Android apps, and that's all good. But really, like, one of the most basic things, I shouldn't say basic thing, but, when people think of software engineers, they think of websites and apps. You're going to tell me I can't make them? Like, I just can't. I can't use Android Studio. It is unusable. And literally, I've seen so many people saying, oh, I want to learn Android Studio. I want to learn how to use Android Studio. And everybody that I've seen replies just like, don't. Please. Do something else. Find another way to do it. It is terrible. You can't. It's horrifying that that's actually a thing, I said, especially if you're a software engineer, you're supposed to be good at problem solving and you're supposed to be efficient. But then instead of spending time, doing your actual job, you have to spend hours and hours and hours investing into doing research, finding alternatives, or whatever it might be instead, which can be honestly really demotivating and has been for me. Sometimes I'm like, okay, well, I had this really cool project in mind, but I'm just not going to make it because I don't know how. I'm going to have to invest who knows how much time into learning how to do this, if I even can. That's exactly what happened to me with game development. And I have had a few ideas as to how I could do that, but in terms of actual game engines, I still haven't found anything that I can use. And that's actually what started this podcast about 8 months ago now, I think, maybe 7, was me realizing that there's no real way for blind people to make games. That's why the first episode, I think it was called Blind People Can't Make Games. And it's sad that that's actually kind of true, because you can't really. There are a few ways, but you can't with actual game engines, which is ridiculous. As always, kind of the conclusions to take away from this here are you need to really advocate for these things. If you're a software engineer, you need to think about these things when you're making software. You need to talk about these things when you're designing software. You need to make sure that the people that you work with are aware of them. And if you aren't a software engineer, you can still help support things that are accessible, as I mentioned in plenty of episodes before. Obviously, if you have a disability, being able to find community support. For example, I'm in a WhatsApp group of visually impaired programmers, right? And a lot of people get advice in there. They ask questions, they learn new things, whatever it might be. So being able to engage with a community like that is really helpful and can honestly make it feel like you're actually not the problem. Because you'll see other people in there having the same problems. And everybody will come together and will say, okay, yeah, this is terrible. Like, how is this actually a thing? So honestly, being able to find that community can be really helpful because you'll see that it's not just you having that experience. Obviously, self-care can be really helpful for helping yourself feel better with these things. Taking breaks, obviously, setting realistic expectations, etc. I know that I've gotten really frustrated at my work sometimes, and I've taken like a 10, 20, 30-minute break, whatever it might be. Even I might take the rest of the day off, and then tomorrow I'll come back and I'll be like, okay, I'm ready to do this. I'm not going to let something not being accessible stop me from achieving my goals or doing this project that I wanted to do. So it can be really helpful to take a break or say, okay, this is a new thing that I'm trying to do. I'm going to set some expectations here that maybe I'm not going to be able to start it today. I'm going to start looking into it. I'm going to see what I can do. I'm going to see if there's any options out there. And I'm not going to put too much pressure on myself to start this and get it done immediately. Because once you find a way to do it, you'll probably be okay. But sometimes finding that way to do it can take a little while. That is going to be it then for this episode of the Envisiontech podcast. As always, I've been your host, Paul Gagan. If you have any questions, comments, or otherwise, feel free to leave them down below or reach out directly to us here at Envisionly, and we will talk to you all next week.